Hi everyone, welcome to Communication and Conflict, promoting mindful communication, growth through conflict. I'm Alan Sharland, and this is video 3 in the series of 3 videos on ineffective and effective responses to conflict. So the first 2 videos, as you may have seen, were about the 2 ineffective responses to conflict. So the first one being the avoidance approach to conflict, and the second one was the competitive approach to conflict. So if you haven't seen those already, I'd encourage you to go and look at them at some stage, either now or after you've watched this one. Links in the information below. And today's video is the third and final one, which is about the 3 cheers for conflict. So the ways in which we use conflict as an opportunity and we resolve conflict. So this is effectively a kind of summary of the features of an effectively resolved conflict. It may not be that in the process of going through resolution of a conflict we're necessarily that conscious that this is what we're doing, but when you look back on any resolved conflict, you'll find that they could be described in any one or more of the 3 cheers for conflict that I'm going to introduce to you today, which are learning, connection, and insight. I've made brief references to those during the last 2 videos just to kind of say how they contrast with the ineffective responses to conflict, but today's video is going to go into much more detail about what I actually mean by learning, connection, and insight. And as I've said before, really what I'm summarizing for you here are the kind of observations that I have when I'm providing mediation for people, and in other contexts where I'm supporting people in resolving their conflict situations, whether that's a broken relationship, whether it's some kind of bullying allegation, whether it's meetings that aren't working, whether it's neighbor disputes, workplace disputes, complaints situations. They're all situations where conflict has arisen and it's either been responded to effectively or it's not been responded to effectively, and therefore it has kept repeating itself. It's stayed stuck, which is basically what I was describing in the first 2 videos, the ways in which conflict remains stuck and can never change because the way that it's being responded to isn't actually focusing on resolution. It's focusing more on kind of personal issues between the people involved. But today's video is looking at the ways where even if there are difficult feelings towards the people we have a conflict with, we can still do things and are still able to be creative and to move forward to create change in the situation and create what, as I say, could be described as learning, connection, and or insight. So once we've gone through this little bit of introductory music, I'll go into more detail when we come back. See you soon. So learning, connection, and insight, the 3 cheers for conflict. So learning relates to the situation itself. So it could be a procedure we're having to follow. It could be the context in which the conflict exists. So it might be a neighbor dispute. It might be something that's happening within the home or in a workplace, or it might be a complaint about a particular issue. So the situation itself is where change can be created that resolves the conflict. So that's where learning happens. Connection is where we come to understand and are open to understanding the other person's point of view without feeling we've got to agree with it. So in the last video in particular, I was talking about the idea that we want to dismiss people's points of view if we're involved in a competitive approach. In connection, we're at least open to hearing their point of view without dismissing it, without having to give a view about it as wrong or crazy or mad and therefore dismissing it. We understand it, but we don't have to agree with it. We're just taking the opportunity to try to understand the other person's perspective. And in insight is where we look to ourselves and think, well, how am I feeling about this? Why is it that I have this difficult feeling, that I feel frightened, or I feel angry, or I feel pissed off, or I feel intimidated, or some other uncomfortable feeling? why do I feel that way, and what change can I create for myself that will help me with that difficult feeling that I have. Um, and that's quite significant, because quite often that's the thing that gets overlooked, because quite often we always externalize where the problem is. We say the problem is the other person, or the problem is the situation, and we don't look at, well, why am I experiencing all this other person and the situation in this way, and what might I be able to do to support myself with it, whether the external situation or the person changes or not. And that sometimes can be the way in which people resolve conflict for themselves, in a sense, without relying on anything external to themselves, which they have no power over, to have to change. So those are the three cheers for conflict. I'll go into a little bit more detail about them in a second, but I just wanted to introduce them broadly first of all. And in a minute, I'll go into looking at the first one, learning, in more detail. So speak to you in a little bit. So learning, I'll give you some examples of learning. And as I say, these will be examples where either something might be created after there's been an unresolved conflict, or it might be something that we just do anyway because we're just very good at resolving conflicts. So an example might be that we drive to work every day, and then one day it starts to be that there's roadworks happen, and it holds up our journey, and we get to work late, or it causes us other inconvenience in some way. Now, what we could do is just simply look to create a different route to get into work. So that would be learning. That would be a change in how we do things, um, in order to resolve that conflict or difficult situation that we're experiencing. So we just do something differently. Now, obviously, sometimes what people will do will just go every day and be unhappy that they're stuck in delays from the roadworks. Um, and that could either be seen as an avoidance response or a competitive response, because there could be, while they're sitting in these delays, kind of criticisms of the terribleness of the local council for allowing it to happen or not getting it done quick enough. Or they could be just kind of sitting there doing nothing, um, or perhaps even not going into work because of the roadworks, rather than looking to create a different route into work. But the point about learning as a resolution of the conflict is that we create an alternative. We create a different way of doing things. So it might be that we actually look on the map and find that there's a different route that we could take, which might then turn out to be a better route anyway, that we'd never realized before, because we'd always done this one particular route. But even if it's not, it's still an alternative that still helps us to do what we want to do, which is to get to work, but we're not held up by the roadworks. In a dispute situation, it might be something like, say, two neighbours living next door to each other, and one does their washing up, their clothes washing, runs their washing machine maybe at 11 o'clock at night on a Thursday, and it's very disturbing to the person downstairs from them. Now, again, the competitive response would be to say what a terrible person that person is upstairs, how bad they are, how inconsiderate they are, etc., etc. And then it gets involved in a competitive response, so it becomes demonization of the other person. Or it could be that the person who experiences the noise from the washing machine just kind of doesn't do anything about it, but gets more and more frustrated, in which case that's an avoidance response, because they're not actually taking any action to support themselves in the situation. Or it could be that either through something like mediation, or just anyway, they communicate with each other, and it's worked out that actually if the washing machine was run on a Wednesday evening at 8 o'clock, it wouldn't cause a problem at all, because the other person goes out on a Wednesday evening. So it doesn't need them to have any connection with each other. They don't need to understand each other's perspective. It's just an understanding that, or change in when the thing is done. So it changes from Thursday at 11 to Wednesday at 8 o'clock, and it doesn't cause a problem anymore. So it's just a simple resolution through something like that. But as I say, you can imagine that in some situations it goes it doesn't get resolved in that way, and it becomes a personal issue between the people involved. How terrible and inconsiderate they are, or how fussy the person downstairs is. It's only going on for an hour, so why is it a problem for them? And this kind of dismissal of each other's views. Another example might be in a workplace. It might be that a particular procedure isn't working for some people. And again, they could spend their time criticizing the people who create the procedure, or the people who carry out their part of the procedure, but it conflicts with something that people who have to carry out their part of the procedure does, and they criticize each other, when actually they're both following the same procedure. But instead, they look to the procedure and go about ways of bringing about change in that procedure. So again, it doesn't become a personal thing between the people involved. They don't start criticizing each other and dismissing each other's points of view. They actually deal with it, and they talk to each other about the procedure. And if they have to go to other people to bring about change in the procedure, they take those actions. So it's taking actions which bring about change in the situation. So it's none of this is particularly about the personal issues between the people involved. It's just doing things differently. So as I say, it might be taking a different route to work. It might be doing the washing, running the washing machine at a different time. It might be changing what's written in a procedure. And you can probably think of other situations where it's just a practical change in what's done. And it's not necessarily about anything to do with the personal relationship between the people involved. So that's a learning change, and in itself, quite often that can be resolved. And some people who work in the mediation field say, well, that's not good enough. It's just solution focused outcome, and it doesn't deal with the fact that the people might not be getting along. Well, people will or won't see that as an important issue. In some situations, people aren't that bothered about whether they get along. They just want to know that they can get on and do the job that they're there to do, or live the life they want to live. And whether they've got a better relationship with the other person or not doesn't matter to them. But if they do want to go further than simply changing the practical aspects of the situation, then they obviously may well look into their personal relationship and how they're communicating with each other as well, and also how they personally respond to it. So that will be to do with connection and insight, which I'll go on to looking at now. So connection is where we understand the other person's point of view without feeling we have to agree with it. And the reason that can make a significant difference in a lot of dispute situations is that it, from many points of view, one is that we understand that how we're seeing a situation isn't the same as how the other person's seeing the situation. So therefore, our actions, based on how we see it, are having an effect on that other person in a way that we hadn't recognized before. Now, again, if we take the competitive approach and say, they're just mad to see it that way, we're not going to take into account how our actions are affecting them. So therefore, we're always going to bump up against their resistance to whatever it is we're doing. So even though we don't agree with their perspective, we don't see it the same way that they do, at least we understand that they're seeing it differently, and therefore it's always going to be an issue if we just keep doing the things we're doing in the way we're doing them without taking into account their perspective. Now, how that actually gets resolved will be unique to the situation, because it may be that we do choose to change how we do things to accommodate how they see it, or it may be that they learn to change their approach to it, to what we're doing, so that it doesn't affect them so much. So there are many ways in which the situation can be resolved. Or it may be, of course, that we actually work together so that what we're doing from our perspective doesn't bump up against them from their perspective as much, and we create together a better way forward. And there are many other different things that can come into simply the acknowledgement of the other person's point of view without having to agree with it, that can then make the situation a much more positive and useful experience, because it means that we connect with that other person, we have a relationship with them, we've understood their perspective, they've they're very likely to appreciate that we've listened to their perspective rather than dismissed it and tried to kind of belittle them, perhaps if it's got into a demonizing situation. And particularly if you imagine a situation where it has been like that in the competitive mode or way of responding, and it's changed to where we started listening to the person and understanding their perspective, and perhaps also in turn they've listened to us. That's not a requirement, by the way. It can just be that we understand their perspective even if they don't seem to be bothered about hearing ours, because in our own interest we're wanting to try to create a better way forward for us, in a sense, whether it's going to help our relationship with them or not. But if we understand how we're doing something better, how what we're doing affects them better than we did before, then it just means we're saving ourselves a lot of hassle by making adjustments in our own way of doing things, whether the other person seems to be interested in our perspective or not. But ideally, obviously, it's preferable if we're both willing to listen to each other's perspectives and understand how the actions that have been happening are affecting us respectively. So that's connection. And as I say, there's so many things really that can come from that, just that simple willingness to hear the other person's perspective without dismissing it. Just on a personal level, if you imagine that someone who you don't seem to be getting along with suddenly does start to say, okay, so what's your perspective on this? So how are you seeing it, and why is it a problem for you that I'm doing it this way? That willingness to find out more from us, what is it that I'm doing that is causing you a problem? That willingness, you can imagine in many situations, just that kind of change in approach melts a lot of very difficult situations into becoming much more constructive and useful. So this is where connection really can kind of transform the personal relationship between people. And as I say, it may not be that that's necessarily important to people, but whether we look at it on a kind of moral basis or we just look at it on an effectiveness basis, it's better all round if we're actually willing to hear the other person's perspective, because we're all operating within a certain kind of system or situation or organic kind of movement of things. And if we're always kind of coming up against a kind of a blockage because we're not really understanding how our actions affect other people, then long term it's never going to go away. But the second we do start to acknowledge that they have a different perspective to us, as I say, whether we like that they have that perspective or not is kind of irrelevant. It's the facts of the matter. It's the reality that they see things differently to us, and try to dismiss it as if to say they're wrong actually makes us powerless, because we can't control how other people see things, but we can listen to it and then do things for ourselves to accommodate the fact that they see it differently. So it's kind of hard to even begin to say how much better it is if we are open to hearing other people's perspectives on things without feeling we have to agree with it, without feeling it's a win or lose situation, and I hesitate to say win-win, because often that's quite a kind of seen as kind of a trivialization of situations. So it's just better for us if we understand other people's perspectives in a difficult situation, because it means that we can accommodate their perspective, so that it's better for us in the long term. We're doing things that mean we're not bumping up against them all the time and having a problem. It also helps us to see that in any difficult situation, it's possible to have a different view. We could resign ourselves to just always having to have this fight, but it wears people out. There are people who do think it's always about winning, and you come across their approach to things. They're just always having to look over their shoulder because somebody else is going to come in with a challenge to what they're doing, because they're not listening to what it is other people have to say. And that definitely wears people out. I'll probably put a quote up by Winston Churchill that relates to that idea while we're speaking, where he talks about dictators, in a sense, always having to be on their guard. And So our willingness to listen to other people's perspectives without that sense we're losing by doing so can be one of the most kind of transformative aspects of responding to a conflict. And as I've said before, a lot of the time we're doing that anyway. We don't even kind of make a big thing about it. If we're dealing with a situation, we understand somebody else's perspective, and we take it on board. But where there's become a problem and we've started to make it kind of more of a personal thing, we're less likely to even want to listen to the other person's perspective because we think, no, they're a bad person, so why should I listen to their point of view? Whereas if it was our friend, we'd probably be very open to listening to it. So it's that, but then it's kind of cutting our nose off to spite our face to do it with the person we don't like, because it's actually making more problems for us in the long term. So connection is a very powerful way of responding to an unresolved conflict, even with people that we might even hate, we might detest, we might have, real vehement kind of resentment of them. But in our own interests, if we take on board that they see things differently to us, it can help us to move forward in our situation, in resolving the conflict situation, the unresolved conflict situation that we're experiencing with them presently. And as I say, in mediation, what I see is this movement of people from this position of competition or avoidance to this position of connection, learning, connection and insight, and how that completely changes their experience of the difficulty they've been having, often in a way that's surprising to them, because they've been willing to hear the other person's perspective and understand why they've done things the way they did, and what's led to them doing that, and what the consequences have been of our actions, which we haven't wanted to hear before because we've dismissed their views, etc. So connection, very, very powerful and useful thing to do, however hard we might find it, given that we dislike the other person. But our willingness to hear their perspective without feeling we've got to agree with it is a very, very powerful change that can help to resolve conflict. So in a minute, on to insight. So finally, insight. If you're still with me, I hope you still are. It's kind of hard to emphasize how significant insight can be in resolving conflict, because so often people feel very, very powerless when they're involved in an unresolved conflict situation. And that's because they're wanting to try to change or control the other person or the situation that they're in. And they have no power to do so, because obviously we can't, unless we want to be dictators, we have no power over what other people do, and often we don't have much power over the situation we find ourselves in either. But what we obviously do have power over, but very rarely consider when we're caught up in an unresolved conflict, what we do have power over is what we're doing to support ourselves within it. And this can so often be overlooked because people are so focused outwardly on what the other person's doing, where they're going, how they're speaking, how they're behaving, or the organization that they're working in and what's wrong with that. And there's very little focus on what the person experiencing that difficulty can do to support themselves within it. And often simply asking people, when they say, oh, this other person's terrible to me, they're bullying me, for example, and asking them things like, well, what is it the person's doing that means you say they're bullying you? And they'll say, well, they shout at me when I get things wrong. And we might find out that, they feel frightened by that, or they feel angry about that, or they feel intimidated by it. And questions can then be asked of someone. So what would you want them to do when you get things wrong? How would you want them to respond to you? Well, I'd rather that they maybe took me aside and spoke to me more quietly, and they didn't shout at me in front of everybody. And often they've not considered actually what they would have wanted instead. they're just unhappy about what has happened. And sometimes an exploration with them, okay, so you'd like them to speak to you more quietly or take you aside. How might that come about? How might that be possible? And often though, people have never even considered that either. They've never considered how they might be able to communicate with the person who they see as bullying them about what they'd want them to do differently. And that doesn't obviously just apply in bullying situations. It can be in any situation. People have not had the time to reflect on, why am I upset by this? Why am I frightened? Why am I so angry? Why am I intimidated? Why do I feel kind of suppressed by what's going on? And what would help me to feel better about this? So often people haven't had the chance to do that. Either they haven't given themselves that time to think about that, or they haven't had a process like mediation or conflict coaching where they can take that time to consider it for themselves, and to think about, okay, so when this person speaks to me like that or shouts at me, what would I like to happen? How do I feel? And what would help me to feel differently, to feel more positive about this? What change can I create that will help me? Because maybe that person won't ever stop speaking to me that way. Maybe that person won't ever stop shouting at me. And I refer to this kind of experience quite a lot because, we hear a lot about trolling and abuse online and things like that. And some people are very, very deeply affected by it, and other people just kind of brush it off. And often it will be about the extent to which people have been able to support themselves given what somebody else has said to them or about them. And some people will take what the person said very, very personally and feel that what needs to change is that other person should stop saying these things. But particularly online, where this other person might be the other side of the world, there's very little power to change that. But what we can look at is, well, what can I do to support myself if someone were to do that again? How would I deal with it differently? Byron Katie, who I do sometimes kind of refer to and quote, and if any of you don't know about her, I'll put a link on the screen about her. But she often says that when we experience a difficult feeling, it's a message to us to create some kind of change in our lives, that we need to kind of revisit how we're dealing with the situation, because all the time we think the problem will only go away when the other person changes. We're always rendering ourselves powerless because we have no control over that. But what we can do is look at, well, what can I do to support myself? And why is it I feel that way? What can I do that might help me not to feel that way, that uncomfortable feeling when this happens? And again, the reason that this comes up is because in mediation, sometimes, and in conflict coaching as well, which is very specifically a one-to-one support, mediation obviously usually looks to bring two or more people together, but conflict coaching is just one-to-one support where we help individuals to think about how they're dealing with a conflict. And what they've often not considered is what they might be able to do for themselves. The focus is outwardly on what the other person's doing, which, as I said, we have no control over. But sometimes, given the opportunity to reflect on how they're dealing with a situation, people can sometimes think, well, actually, yeah, why do I feel that way? And what might I be able to do to help myself? And sometimes people have, so far in their difficult situation, only thought of very extreme things in their about how they're going to support themselves. So in a workplace, if they've got a problem, they may say, I'm going to leave my job. Or in a neighbour dispute, they may say, we're going to move house. And often those are extremely significant changes that they're considering. And in essence, quite often they're avoidance responses because they're not looking at what they can actually do to support themselves in the situation. They're just saying, the only way I'm going to deal with this is to move away, either home or job-wise, from the person. And that's the only way this is going to get resolved, rather than look at, well, what might they do differently? and I'll try to be brief about this, but we had a situation when I used to work in neighbour mediation where there was an elderly lady who was actually very, very upset about the parking of a neighbour of hers who was parking in a place that she found very inconvenient. And she got to the point where she was saying to the mediators when she visited, if they keep doing it, I'm going to go out and smash their windscreen with a golf club. Um, uh, that was presently her way of thinking that she was going to deal with it. And I think also I might move home as well. And these were the two things that she was considering as a response to her neighbour conflict. Now, so far she hadn't even communicated to her neighbour that she was upset about the car parking. It was something that she'd called us in because she was wanting to consider mediation, in which case we'd have then made contact with the neighbour. But just through talking through with the mediators, what was happening, how she felt about it, what she was considering doing in response, how she felt about those ideas for smashing the windscreen or moving home or whatever, she was able to start thinking, well, why am I so upset by this? The person is parking their car 6 inches further across my drive than I would like them to. I feel it's invading my space, but how does it actually affect me? What is the actual impact on me of this? And obviously, really at root, she was very competitively responded. She was very offended that they were doing it, and understandably so. They weren't being, in her eyes, very considerate. But that was her response, to think about being very kind of destructive in response, or very, in a sense, damaging to herself, to move away. And in the end, what she decided was that she didn't need to feel so upset by it. Now, it's not for us to tell her that. It's not for us to tell her how she should or shouldn't feel in the situation. She came to that decision herself just through being given a chance to reflect on her own responses. It's not for us to judge or decide for people how they should or shouldn't feel in situations. That would be entirely wrong for us to say, oh, you're making too much of this, or something patronizing like that. You'd never do that if you're a mediator, or you shouldn't if you're a mediator, because we're all affected in different ways. But in time, she came to realize that actually when she was getting upset, she thought, actually, I'll go and visit my family and have a nice time with them, or I'll go for a walk, or I'll call my family out, my grandkids out, and I'll take them for a walk. So she created what for her was a much more constructive, useful response to the fact that her neighbour was parking 6 inches over onto her drive, and she was very upset about it. Now, ultimately, she may or may not have decided that she wanted to go and communicate with her neighbour about the problem. But in a sense, whether she did or she didn't want to do that, she'd created a better response for herself about what she was experiencing. And it didn't go any further than that. She didn't want necessarily for us to do anything further, because she was considering her own ways of dealing with things differently for herself. And again, lots of people might hear that and say, oh no, she should do this, she should do that. It's none of our business how she deals with it. It's her situation. It's not for us to stick our nose in and tell her what she should or shouldn't do. But she created for herself better ideas for how to, better from her perspective, ideas for how she wanted to deal with the situation. So that was just insight. Nothing else changed. She didn't even have a connection with the other person. She wasn't even interested in their perspective. She just created for herself a better way of dealing with her situation. And I could give you many, many other examples of where people have resolved a conflict they see themselves as being in and stuck in, simply through changing their own perspective of and their way of feeling, and how they might support themselves with that difficult feeling in response to the situation they found themselves in. So nothing changed externally whatsoever. They created a different way of seeing and then supporting themselves with their situation. And that sometimes is such a powerful change, that it doesn't need anybody else to do anything differently, that other people will carry on being what they are, who they are, how they are, and we can change the way we support ourselves in a difficult situation in such a way that it actually no more is a problem for us that they behave that way. But so often, and actually in so many kind of support organizations, the support is to try to demonize the other person for what they do. And it actually reinforces people's sense of powerlessness because it's only focusing on changing the outer things rather than helping people to look at their own inner response to the situation. And insight is that powerful that it literally can just help people to almost let go of a conflict just through looking at their own way of dealing with things, how they feel about it, and how they can support themselves with that difficult feeling. And that's particularly significant in bullying situations, which was why I mentioned that at the start. But it's true in any situation that how we're feeling about the problem and the person that we have the problem with, and how we're supporting ourselves with that, can often be all that's needed for consideration in order to create a way through it for ourselves. And it's not letting the other person get away with it, because actually if we're finding a way of supporting ourselves and it's not a problem anymore, there's nothing they're getting away with anymore, because we're actually seeing it as a problem that can be overcome from it just by things that we do. So that's the power of insight, is that we create change in how we see things and we respond to things, irrespective of what the other person does, and not needing there to be a change in that, which is where often we render ourselves powerless in conflict situations. So that's the 3 cheers for conflicts: learning, connection, and insight. I hope that's been interesting. As you know already, these videos aren't kind of quick, punchy videos with quick do this, do that, do this, do that kind of directives. The aim is to kind of give a chance to kind of reflect on and ponder what happens in conflict and whether what I'm saying relates to your experience of unresolved conflict and how you're dealing with it. So I hope it's been useful. I hope you find the other 2 videos useful as well, if you've been able to watch them. If not, then there's links below. And if you do find it interesting, or if you've got comments about things that you'd like to say, you'd like to comment on the content of what I've said, whether it's helped you, whether it's not clear to you, whether you've got questions, whether you've got requests for other things you'd like me to do videos about, then please put them in the comments section below. And thanks again for watching. I'll be coming out with some more videos fairly soon. I'm not sure what topics, but I've got plenty that are possible topics, but I'm also happy to be guided by what you request as well. Thanks for watching, as I said, and hope to see you again soon. Bye bye. Thanks for watching and listening to this video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, please click the like button below to give it a thumbs up, and if you would like to see more in the future, please subscribe to my channel. Please also share it on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, or any other social media if you think others may want to see the video. If you have any comments or questions or requests for future topics for other videos relating to communication and conflict, please put them in the comments section below. So thanks very much for watching. Have a great day, and I hope to see you soon. Bye bye.